Louisiana horror, raising shrimp with human flesh, and revealing the chilling truth. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. What would you do if the people you trusted most, the ones under your own roof, were hiding the darkest secret of all? The Miller case shocked an entire community, but the truth runs even deeper. And this is only the beginning. If you don't want to miss the next chapter of this chilling story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. More twists, more secrets, and more unforgettable cases are on the way. It was the kind of summer morning in Louisiana that seemed almost too peaceful to hold any darkness. The cicadas buzzed lazily in the oak trees, and the humid air clung to every breath. Houma, a small town nestled deep in Terrebonne Parish, had always carried a rhythm of its own shrimp boats drifting out before dawn, workers in rubber boots trudging along the marshland, and families gathering at diners for hot coffee before the sun climbed too high. Life here revolved around the water, around the shrimp that had built fortunes and swallowed them just as quickly. On the morning of the 8th of June 2022, the sheriff's office opened its doors to an unexpected scene. Thomas Miller, known to nearly everyone as Tom, the wealthy but stern owner of one of the largest shrimp farms in the parish, walked in with his daughter-in-law, Emily Miller. Tom's weathered face was stiff, his voice low but steady, while Emily's eyes were swollen, her hands trembling as she clutched her blouse. Together, they reported something that would send ripples far beyond their family farm. David Miller, Tom's only son and Emily's husband, had been missing for 2 days. Tom's explanation was delivered without hesitation. He claimed David had stormed out after a heated argument about the farm. David had always been too soft, Tom said, too naive to handle the brutal business of shrimping. After their fight, David announced he was leaving for New Orleans to make a life of his own. Tom's expression suggested frustration more than fear, as if this disappearance was simply the tantrum of a son unwilling to shoulder responsibility. Emily's version, however, carried a different weight. Her voice cracked as she told officers that David had called her once, briefly, assuring her not to worry, that he was safe, that he was only looking for work. But when she tried calling back, his phone was no longer reachable. Her tears fell quickly, painting her as a grieving wife desperate for answers. At first glance, the report seemed like a familiar story in a small town. Young men had left before, chasing opportunity in New Orleans or Baton Rouge, sometimes without a word. The deputies on duty treated it as just another case of a grown man walking away from his obligations. They noted the details, filed the paperwork, and assumed David would resurface within a few days. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary missing persons case, something didn't sit right. The contrast between Tom's rigid composure and Emily's fragile sorrow felt rehearsed, as though both were performing for an unseen audience. There was a strange absence of panic, an unnatural calm that lingered in the air of the sheriff's office that morning. What no one realized at that moment was that the heart of the Miller farm, the sprawling ponds of shrimp shimmering under the Louisiana sun, was not just a source of livelihood. It was about to become the stage for one of the darkest revelations the parish had ever seen. Detective Michael Harris had spent more than 30 years reading people, and if experience had taught him anything, it was this: truth rarely came dressed in clean lines. When the Miller file landed on his desk, he sensed from the first page that something was off. On the surface, the report was ordinary. A grown man, upset with his father, leaving home to prove himself. But the details didn't sit right. Why would David reassure his wife, and then vanish without another word? Why wait 2 days to report him missing? These weren't the actions of a runaway. They were the fingerprints of a cover-up. He called Officer Linda Parker into his office, the young partner he had been training for a year. She was quick, restless, and sometimes too eager, but Harris trusted her instincts. "Pull the phone records," he said, handing her the file. "If David called Emily like she says, it'll be there." Linda nodded, already reaching for the phone. By late afternoon, the results arrived, a stack of printed logs that told a colder story than any witness ever could. Harris studied them in silence, his jaw tightening. There was no call from David to Emily, not a single ping from his phone since the night of June 6th. It was as if the device and the man had been switched off for good. Linda paced the room. "So she lied," she muttered. Harris leaned back in his chair. "Or she's protecting someone," he said. Either way, David didn't just walk away. Something happened, and it happened at that farm. The following morning, Harris drove toward the Miller estate, Linda in the passenger seat. The roads wound through marshland, cypress trees rising from the water like ancient guardians, their branches heavy with moss. The sun beat down hard, and in the distance the farmhouse appeared, bright white against the murky ponds. From afar, it looked like success, a monument to years of labor and fortune. But as they rolled into the driveway, Harris felt a weight in his chest. Emily stood waiting on the porch, pale and nervous, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. Tom emerged moments later, tall and broad, his expression hard as carved stone. The workers nearby fell quiet, their eyes cast to the ground, their shoulders tense. Harris recognized the atmosphere instantly. This was a household ruled by influence and fear. Inside, the house smelled faintly of bleach. Every surface gleamed under the Louisiana sun streaming through the windows. Harris had seen hundreds of homes in crisis, and they were never this clean. Grief left a mess. Panic left traces. What he smelled here was preparation. David's room was no different. Clothes folded, shoes lined in perfect rows, nothing missing from the closet. On the nightstand, a cigarette stub sat in the ashtray, half-burned, abandoned mid-drag. Harris leaned closer, the detail striking him like a whisper from the dead. A man planning to leave didn't stop mid-drag. He finished the smoke, grabbed his things, and stormed out. This was something else. "I haven't touched a thing," Emily said softly behind him, her voice trembling. "I couldn't bear to." Harris didn't respond. He had heard the line before. It sounded rehearsed. It sounded like a performance. He stepped back into the hallway, his eyes sweeping across the spotless floor, the polished wood, the house that looked less like a family home and more like a stage set. Back outside, the air shifted. A breeze carried over the ponds, and with it came a faint odor, sour beneath the usual brine. Harris paused, squinting across the rows of water glistening under the Louisiana sun. To anyone else it would look like a normal day on a shrimp farm. To him, it felt like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be dragged out of the mud. The ride back to the station was quiet. Linda finally broke the silence. "What do you think?" she asked. Harris kept his eyes on the road. "I think David never left this property," he said, "and I think his father knows more than he's saying." The words hung heavy in the car, echoing the suspicion that had been growing since the first glance at the file. The case had already shifted. It was no longer a missing person. It was the beginning of a criminal investigation. What Harris didn't yet know was that someone within the farm's walls had already noticed something strange in those ponds. And soon that voice would come forward, breaking the silence that had kept the Miller family's secret safe for far too long. The Miller farm stretched wide across the marsh, a patchwork of ponds glinting under the summer sun. From a distance, it looked alive with promise nets strung between poles, workers in tall rubber boots wading through the shallows, the metallic hum of pumps keeping the water circulating. But when Detective Harris stepped onto the property, he felt none of that promise. Instead, he felt the silence. The workers spoke little, their eyes shifting nervously whenever a deputy approached. Most of them stuck to the same line, almost word for word. David had left after an argument, and no one had seen him since. Harris had questioned laborers all his life, and this was not how they usually spoke. Fear had a way of making people uniform, as though they had been handed a script. He didn't buy it. It was Samuel Johnson who finally broke the pattern. Sam had worked on the Miller farm for more than 20 years. His skin weathered by the Louisiana sun, his back bent from hauling nets and feed bags. He avoided eye contact all morning, and Harris could see the weight of something pressing him down. When the others drifted back to their cabins, Harris caught him near the tool shed. "Sam," he said quietly, "you've been here longer than anyone. You know this place. If something doesn't feel right, you can tell me." Sam rubbed the brim of his hat, his lips tight. For a long moment, Harris thought he would say nothing. Then the old man's voice dropped low. "It's the number 5 pond," he whispered. "The shrimp. They've been coming up at night. Not normal. They rise too often, too fast. I've never seen them act that way. And a few nights back I saw Emily out there, standing by the water, late, when nobody else was around." Fear flickered in his eyes as he finished. "Don't tell anyone I said that, please." "Oh," Harris laid a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, and no one else will hear it from me." Later that evening, Harris sat in a makeshift office at the sheriff's substation, a map of the Miller property spread across the table. Each pond was numbered in thick black ink, but his pen circled one in particular, Pond Number 5. To the untrained eye, it looked no different from the others. To Harris, it was a question demanding an answer. "We focus here," he told his team. Linda Parker leaned in, her brow furrowed. "If there's something in that water, time is against us. Evidence won't last." Harris nodded. "Then we don't waste time. We secure it tonight." By dusk, yellow tape stretched around the perimeter of Pond 5. Deputies posted signs declaring the area under investigation, warning workers to stay away. Floodlights cut through the darkening marsh, their glow spilling across the rippling water. At Harris's order, cameras were mounted along the fence, pointed straight at the pond. To an outsider, it might have looked excessive, even theatrical. But Harris had spent his career watching guilty men return to the scene of their crime. They couldn't help themselves. They came to check, to make sure their secret was still safe. And he was counting on that weakness. Night came heavy and humid, the buzz of cicadas and frogs filling the air. Back at the substation, Harris and Linda sat in front of the monitors, the glow painting their faces in shades of blue and gray. Hours ticked by. The water shimmered under the artificial lights, but nothing moved. Midnight crept closer, and Linda stifled a yawn. Then Harris leaned forward. "There," he whispered. A figure had appeared on the screen, moving slowly into frame. Emily Miller. She stood at the edge of the pond, her arms wrapped tight across her chest. For nearly 10 minutes she didn't move, her gaze fixed on the water as if it might rise and speak to her. Harris studied her face, the tightness in her jaw, the way her shoulders stiffened. It wasn't grief he saw, it was fear. The fear of a secret slipping from her grasp. "She knows," Linda said softly. Harris gave a single nod. "She knows exactly what's in that pond." The decision came quickly the next morning. Harris gathered his team, his voice firm. "We're draining it. I don't care how much it costs or how long it takes. That pond is going to tell us what happened." He knew the risk if nothing was found. He would answer for it. But every instinct told him Pond Number 5 was the key. As the deputies prepared the pumps, Harris stood at the edge of the marsh, watching the water ripple in the early light. The pond seemed calm, but beneath that surface, something waited. Not forever. Not much longer. The water itself was about to betray its secret. The morning of June 10th broke heavy with clouds, the kind of Louisiana sky that seemed to press down on the earth. At 5 a.m., the hum of machinery shattered the quiet of the Miller farm. Deputies had rolled in a pair of industrial pumps, their long hoses plunging into the murky water of Pond Number 5. The workers who gathered at the perimeter kept their distance, whispering among themselves. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared, their eyes wide with the kind of dread that comes when the ground beneath you is about to give up its secrets. Detective Michael Harris stood at the edge of the pond, hands in his pockets, his face set like stone. He had overseen dozens of searches in his career, but this felt different. Even the cicadas seemed muted, as though the marsh itself was holding its breath. Beside him, Officer Linda Parker shifted from one foot to the other, her arms crossed tight, her gaze fixed on the churning water. Slowly, inch by inch, the pond began to give way. The water level dropped steadily, exposing slick patches of dark silt. By 7 o'clock, half the pond lay shallow, the banks widened, and the smell grew stronger. It clung to the back of the throat, not just the brine of shrimp water, but something heavier, sour, unmistakable. Harris said nothing, but Linda's eyes darted toward him, silently asking if he smelled it too. He gave the faintest nod. The deputies worked in silence, the only sounds the growl of the pumps and the trickle of water draining away, each minute stretched, taut as a wire. Either they would find nothing and stand accused of wasting resources, or they would find what Harris already knew was there, At 8:15, the silence broke. A technician shouted from the western corner. "Something in the mud?" Harris strode across the slippery bank, his boots sinking deep. At first, it looked like debris, a dark lump tangled in weeds. But as the water receded further, the shape took on form, bound, weighted, deliberate. The stench hit harder now, metallic and foul, the smell of death long concealed. Deputies closed in, their movements careful. A heavy object emerged, wrapped in rope and lashed to a stone anchor. The mud clung stubbornly. But when the last of the water drained, there was no denying the truth. A body. Even Harris, hardened by decades in the field, felt a tightening in his chest. He gave the order in a steady voice. "Get it up. Careful. Document everything." The recovery team moved with precision. Cameras flashed, evidence markers were placed, and slowly the figure was pulled free. The ropes had cut deep, binding the limbs tight. The face was unrecognizable, but the clothing spoke. A green shirt with white stripes at the sleeves, jeans worn thin at the knees. And in the right pocket, a gold band, caked in mud but still gleaming faintly. Inside it, 2 initials were engraved, D and E. Linda's breath caught. Harris studied the ring in his gloved hand. He didn't need the inscription to confirm it, but it left no room for doubt. David Miller had never left this farm. He had been here all along, lying in the water that fed his family's fortune. The body was laid out beneath a white tarp at the bank's edge. The forensic specialists worked quickly, murmuring their observations. Linda took notes, her pen trembling, her young face pale with shock. Harris stood silent, his expression unreadable, but his eyes followed every detail. The preliminary findings came fast. David had not drowned. Bruising at the back of the skull revealed a brutal blow, enough to knock him unconscious before he was ever tied and dropped into the pond. It was not an accident. It was a killing. Harris felt the weight of the words as he looked toward the farmhouse. Tom Miller stood at a distance, rigid, his face carved from stone. Emily trembled nearby, tears streaking her cheeks as if she had just lost him for the first time. But Harris had seen enough false grief to recognize it. Her tears were not for David. They were for herself. One deputy turned away, gagging at the sight. Another froze, his eyes wide. Sam Johnson, watching from the crowd, dropped his hat to the ground and whispered, "Lord have mercy." Harris's jaw tightened. He had been right from the beginning. What lay beneath the water had spoken more clearly than any witness. By noon, the area was sealed, evidence cataloged, and the body transported for full autopsy. Harris lingered at the drained pond, staring into the black mud still clinging to the ropes and anchor stone. In that silence, he thought of David not just as a body, but as a son betrayed in the cruelest way. He drew a slow breath and turned away. The search for David Miller was over. But the reckoning for those who had put him there was only beginning. The interrogation rooms at the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office were plain, built to strip away pretense. White walls, a metal table, 2 chairs. No windows, just the hum of a fluorescent bulb overhead. Detective Michael Harris had spent half his career in these rooms, watching the guilty unravel thread by thread. That afternoon, Tom Miller and Emily Miller were brought in separately. Harris insisted they remain apart. A shared lie was strongest when told together, but isolation cracked the foundation. He began with Emily. She sat hunched in the chair, her eyes swollen, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked the part of a grieving widow, but Harris had seen enough to know performance when he saw it. He slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside were photographs, printouts of phone records showing no call from David, still images from the surveillance cameras showing her standing at pond number 5 in the dead of night. Emily's face drained of color. Her lips parted, then closed again. Harris kept his voice calm. "You said you hadn't been near the ponds, but the camera shows you were there. 10 minutes, just watching. Why?" Her voice faltered. I didn't know what to do." "Didn't know what to do about losing your husband?" Harris asked evenly. "Or about what we would find in that water?" Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. She lowered her gaze to the table, her words barely audible. "I didn't want it to happen," she whispered. "But once it started, I couldn't stop it." Harris leaned back, letting the silence fill the room. He had no intention of pushing further, at least not yet. Her cracks were beginning to show. That was enough. He stood, gathered the folder, and left her alone with her words echoing in the fluorescent light. Across the hall, Tom Miller waited with his arms folded, leaning back in his chair like a man immune to the setting. His expression was calm, almost smug. Harris entered, dropped a stack of photographs onto the table, and slid them across. The images showed the drained pond, the ropes, the anchor stone, the wedding band. "That's your son?" Harris asked. Tom gave a single nod. "That's him. You don't look surprised." Tom's mouth curved in something close to a smirk. "I told you he walked out. Looks like he didn't get far." Harris studied him. Most fathers broke when faced with their child's body. Tom remained unmoved, as if the images were nothing more than business paperwork. "The autopsy shows David didn't drown," Harris said quietly. "He was struck from behind before he was tied and weighted. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fight that got out of hand. Somebody planned it." For the first time, Tom's eyes flickered. His jaw tightened. But the mask returned quickly, cold and steady. "People fight," he said. "Things happen. You should know that by now." Harris leaned forward, his voice firm. "This was no outburst. It was a choice." The silence that followed was heavy. Harris didn't expect Tom to confess, not yet. But he had seen the shift, the small crack in the armor. Pride and control had kept Tom composed this far, but beneath that calm was rage, arrogance, and the conviction that his actions had reason. When Harris stepped out into the hallway, Linda Parker was waiting, her notebook tucked under her arm. 35, sharp-eyed, still carrying the energy of someone new to the job, she looked tense. "They're both hiding something," she said. "They're hiding the same thing," Harris replied. "The only question is which one decides to betray the other first." He glanced back toward the closed doors of the interrogation rooms. Emily's trembling words and Tom's icy detachment were two sides of the same crime. This was no crime of passion. It was deliberate, calculated, born of greed and something darker, and Harris knew that once loyalty fractured, the truth would come spilling out. For now, all he had to do was wait. The second time Harris entered the room, Emily looked different. The brittle defiance she had tried to carry earlier was gone, replaced by the sagging weight of someone too tired to keep lying. Her makeup had smudged into faint streaks, her shoulders drooped, and her fingers tapped nervously against the table's cold steel. Harris placed a cup of water in front of her and sat down without speaking. Silence had always been his sharpest tool, and he let it work now. Minutes ticked by before Emily finally lifted her eyes. "If I tell you everything," she whispered, "will it matter? Will it change what happens to me?" "I can't promise you how the court will judge," Harris said calmly. "But I can promise this. Truth carries weight. What you say now will shape what comes next." Emily pressed her palms to her face, as if bracing herself. When she spoke again, her voice was low and raw. "It didn't start with David. It started with Tom." Harris didn't move, didn't interrupt. "Last spring," Emily continued, "David was gone for a few days on business. Tom came by with a bottle of wine. At first I thought it was just kindness, checking in on me. But he wasn't just being kind. He crossed a line. I told him no, but I didn't fight hard enough. And after that night, it didn't stop. He had a way of making me feel like refusing him would cost me more than giving in." She swallowed, her face twisted in shame. "I was afraid of him. And yet, little by little, I stopped resisting." She paused, staring at her trembling hands. "Tom never believed in David, said he was weak, unfit to run the farm. He kept saying all his hard work would be wasted if David took control. At first, it sounded like anger, but then it turned into something darker. He told me if David weren't in the picture, the farm could be ours, that together we could keep it strong. I thought he was out of his mind. I said no, again and again, but he kept pressing, and eventually, I stopped saying no at all." Harris leaned forward, his voice steady. "So what happened the night David disappeared?" Emily's eyes shimmered, but she forced herself to continue. "Tom told me to call David, tell him I wanted to make peace. I cried into the phone, begged him to meet me near the storage shed by the ponds. David agreed he always did when I asked. That was his mistake." Her voice cracked. "When David came, I hugged him, told him I was sorry. He turned for just a moment, and Tom stepped out from the shadows. He had a wooden post in his hands. He swung it hard into the back of David's head. David went down instantly. I froze. I couldn't move. Tom shouted at me to help, so I did. We dragged David into the shed, tied his hands and feet with rope Tom had already prepared. It was like he'd rehearsed it all. Tears spilled down her cheeks. We tied him to an anchor stone from the dock, rolled him out on the cart, and pushed him into pond number 5. The splash echoed, then everything was quiet again. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run. But Tom was calm. Too calm. He told me to change my clothes, wash my face, act like a grieving wife. He promised no one would ever find out. Emily's chest heaved as the words tumbled out. I know what it sounds like, that I wanted David gone, that I chose Tom. But I didn't. I was trapped, pulled deeper until I couldn't see a way out. I never swung the post. I didn't kill him. But I didn't stop it either. Harris studied her, his expression unreadable. He knew the courts would decide how much of her story was manipulation and how much was truth, but her testimony had cracked the wall wide open. The murder of David Miller was no longer guesswork, it was confession. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand, her voice barely audible. Detective, do you think there's any forgiveness for someone like me? Harris rose slowly, gathering the file. He paused at the door, his back to her. Forgiveness isn't mine to give, he said. But you've started telling the truth. And now Tom will have to face it too. When Tom Miller was brought back into the interrogation room, he walked in with the air of a man who still believed he could control the outcome. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, and there was the faint trace of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. He sat down as if this were a meeting about crops and markets rather than a confrontation about his son's death. Detective Michael Harris placed a file on the table and lowered himself into the chair across from him. He didn't speak right away. He knew silence could be as sharp as a blade, and he let it cut. Tom shifted slightly, then gave a dry laugh that carried more arrogance than humor. So, did the girl give you her sob story yet? She's always been good at that, always knew how to twist things. Harris kept his expression steady. He opened the file and slid a page across the table. Emily gave a statement, he said evenly. She claims you planned everything. She says you struck David and told her your son wasn't fit to run the farm. The smirk fell from Tom's face and was replaced by a sneer. Of course she'd say that. She's weak. She's always been afraid, always looking for someone else to blame. And now she's trying to save herself by blaming me. Harris leaned back in his chair, speaking calmly. She says you hated your son. Tom's jaw worked as his temper rose. Hated? Number. But I knew him. He didn't have the grit. He couldn't shoulder the weight of this place. Everything I built with my hands, every acre and every dollar, he would have squandered. He would have let it all slip away. Harris's voice was quiet. So you decided to make sure he'd never get the chance? Tom's hand slammed down on the table, rattling the legs and echoing through the room. His voice came out raw and sharp. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to kill my own flesh and blood? I didn't want to, but he left me no choice. He was a liability. And he jabbed a finger toward the wall, toward the room where Emily sat waiting. She begged me to fix it. She said she couldn't stand him anymore. Don't let her play the saint. She wanted it as much as I did. Harris stayed quiet, letting Tom's fury swirl and fill the silence. Then, with deliberate calm, he asked, So you didn't swing the post? Tom hesitated, his nostrils flaring as the mask of control began to slip. She's lying if she says she didn't want it, he snapped. But he stopped, realizing too late that he had cornered himself. His voice cracked into a snarl. Fine. Yes, I swung it. Yes, I put him down. But don't you dare call me a monster. I did what had to be done. For this farm, for everything I bled for. The words landed heavy in the room. Harris leaned back, his face composed, his voice level. You just confessed to killing your son, Mr. Miller? For the first time, Tom's bravado wavered. His color rose, his chest heaved, and he dragged a trembling hand through his hair. You don't understand, he muttered, almost to himself. David wasn't cut out for this world. He was going to ruin everything. I couldn't stand by and watch it all collapse. I couldn't. His words fell into a bitter laugh that carried no triumph, only exhaustion. Behind the one-way glass, Officer Linda Parker stood frozen, her pen hovering above her notebook. She glanced at Harris, her face tight with disbelief, but Harris remained still. He had seen this before, pride unraveling, arrogance turning to ashes. Tom hadn't been broken by clever questions. He had broken himself. Harris leaned forward once more, his tone steady as steel. You say you built this farm with your bare hands. But when people remember your name, will they remember a builder? Or will they remember a man who murdered his only son? Tom's shoulders sagged, his eyes dropping to the table. The arrogance drained from him in an instant. For the first time, he looked smaller, diminished, not a patriarch or a landowner, but just another man cornered by his own choices. Harris rose from his chair, gathered the file, and moved toward the door. We'll get your full statement recorded. But understand this, your words here have already sealed your fate. As the door clicked shut behind him, Tom let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and buried his face in his hands. For a man who had spent his life controlling every outcome, this was the one ending he could not shape. In the hallway, Linda finally released the breath she had been holding. He handed it to us, she whispered. Harris looked back toward the closed door, his eyes hard. No, he said quietly. He handed it to himself. Pride always buries deeper than any pond. The air inside the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office felt heavier the next morning. Overnight, Tom Miller's outburst had given investigators what they needed, an admission, raw and undeniable. But Harris knew better than to think the case was finished. A confession born in anger could be softened or twisted in court. What they needed now was the whole tapestry of truth, pieced together through contradictions and betrayal. That meant hearing Tom and Emily again, this time separately, but against each other's words. Emily was brought in first. She looked hollowed out, her eyes swollen from crying, her shoulders sagging as if she hadn't slept. Harris sat across from her, his hands folded. Tom admitted to striking David. He began evenly. Relief flickered across her face for half a second before Harris continued. But he also claims you pushed him into it, that you wanted David gone as much as he did. Waroo! Her head jerked up, outrage breaking through exhaustion. That's not true, she cried. I never begged him. He cornered me, used my fear against me. I did what he told me because I didn't see a way out. Harris studied her calmly. So you never asked him to act? Emily shook her head violently. I wanted the fighting to stop. That's all. David and Tom couldn't go a day without tearing into each other. But I never wanted David dead. Tom made it sound like there was no other choice. He twisted it until silence felt like consent. Her hands shook on the table. He's lying if he says I planned it. Harris said nothing more, only rose and left her with her protest hanging in the air. Across the hall, Tom Miller sat stiff and seething. When Harris entered, Tom leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. So she turned on me, didn't she? Told you I was the villain, and she was just the poor victim. That's how she's always played it. But don't you buy it. She was in as deep as me. How? Harris asked quietly. Tom's fist clenched on the table. She's the one who lured him out. She made the call. She cried into the phone, played the loving wife who wanted peace. Without her, David never would have gone near that shed. She pressed me again and again, said she couldn't take living with him. You think I dreamed this up alone? Number. She set the stage. I just carried it through. You carried it through, Harris repeated. Tom slammed his hand flat on the table. Yes. She set it up. I swung the post. She wants to wash her hands clean now, but she's no victim. She wanted him gone, and she made sure it happened. Behind the one-way glass, Officer Linda Parker jotted notes quickly, her brow furrowed. When Harris stepped into the hall, she met his eyes. They're both clawing at each other, she said quietly, each trying to survive. Exactly what we needed, Harris answered. Their stories don't line up anymore, but the gaps are where the truth shows. That afternoon, Harris had their statements read back to them. Emily listened as Tom's words were recited, that she begged him, that she orchestrated the call, that she wanted David gone. She shook her head violently, tears streaming. No, he's twisting everything. I didn't tie him. I didn't drop him in that pond. That was Tom. He's trying to bury me because he knows what he did. Hours later, Tom heard Emily's words, her claims that he pressured her, manipulated her, and struck David himself. His face turned red, his voice thundered through the walls. Manipulated? She came to me. She said David was useless, that he didn't deserve her or the farm. She wanted him out of the way. And now she hides behind tears? Number. She was as guilty as I am. By evening, Harris sat with the case file spread before him. The puzzle was complete. Emily had admitted to making the call, Tom to swinging the blow. Both acknowledged dragging David's body, tying it, weighting it down, and pushing it into the pond. Neither told the whole truth, but together their accusations painted the entire crime. Linda stepped in quietly. "So, who's telling the truth?" she asked. "They both are," Harris said. "They just don't realize it. She lured him. He killed him. Together, they hid it. And now the bond that held them has turned into a knife they're using against each other." Outside, the Louisiana night settled over the marsh, the ponds reflecting the fading light. The farm still stood, silent and unchanged. But inside the sheriff's office, Tom and Emily Miller's empire had collapsed. What once bound them together was now tearing them apart, and the lies that had hidden their crime had finally betrayed them. By mid-June of 2022, the Miller case had spilled far beyond Terrebonne Parish. What began as a missing persons report was now a story carried by every major paper in Louisiana. "Shrimp Farm Murder," one headline blared. Others used words like betrayal, parricide, and unthinkable. In cafes and bait shops, over plates of biscuits and coffee, conversation circled endlessly back to Tom and Emily Miller. Some locals shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered they had always felt something strange about the Miller farm. Inside the sheriff's office, Michael Harris cared little for the chatter. His task was to ensure that the case was ironclad. Forensics confirmed what both Tom and Emily had admitted in fragments. David Miller had been struck from behind, bound with rope, weighted with a dock anchor, and dumped in pond number 5. The rope fibers matched spools in the Miller shed. The wooden post used in the attack carried faint traces of blood and hair. Cart tracks in the mud lined perfectly with farm equipment. No matter how Tom and Emily twisted their stories, the evidence did not bend. The motive, once clouded in their accusations, had hardened into view. Tom, proud and controlling, could not hand his empire to a son he deemed unworthy. Emily, caught in fear and entanglement, allowed herself to be drawn into his scheme. Together, they plotted the lure, the blow, and the cover-up. When pressure came, each tried to shift blame, but their own words stitched the crime together. The district attorney wasted no time. Tom Miller was charged with first-degree murder. Emily Miller faced charges of conspiracy and accessory. Reporters descended on the courthouse steps, cameras glaring, microphones thrust at anyone connected to the case. The community buzzed with speculation. To them, the Miller farm had long stood as a symbol of hard work and success. Now it was a story of betrayal written in the mud of a shrimp pond. Harris spent long days with prosecutors, walking them through the evidence. Linda Parker, ever at his side with her notebook, was struck by how clean the narrative had become. "There's no space for doubt," she said one evening. "The jury will see it." Harris only gave a measured nod. He knew cases were never truly airtight until the verdict fell. Meanwhile, in separate cells, Tom and Emily stewed. Tom raged that Emily had ruined him, painting her as the manipulator. Emily sobbed that Tom had trapped her, insisting she was a victim long before David's death. Their lawyers shaped defenses that pointed fingers across the aisle. The alliance that once bound them was gone. All that remained was self-preservation. Beyond the courthouse, the parish seethed. In church pews, prayers rose for David's soul. At shrimp docks, men muttered that the bayou had spit the truth back out. Old friends admitted they had noticed cracks in the Miller family, but never imagined such an end. The farm that once inspired envy now stood as a warning. One July evening, Harris drove past the Miller property. The land was quiet, the ponds reflecting the sinking sun. Pond number 5, drained and scarred, lay under a web of tape. The farmhouse stood pale and silent. Harris leaned against the fence for a long time, listening to cicadas and frogs. He thought of David, just 32, betrayed by the very people meant to protect him. The weight of that betrayal pressed heavier than the Louisiana heat. Back in town, jury summons arrived. The trial was set for autumn. Neighbors speculated about Tom's sentence, death row, some said, or at the very least, life behind bars. Emily divided opinion. Some saw a cold conspirator, others a woman trapped. Either way, no one doubted justice was moving forward. On his desk, Harris kept David's photograph. The young man's faint smile stared out in quiet reminder. Harris would glance at it between meetings, telling himself that justice wasn't about headlines or trials. It was about lives like David's, ordinary, fragile, stolen too soon. As summer thickened over the bayou, the Miller farm stood abandoned, its silence heavier than any rumor. But in the courthouse downtown, the wheels of justice gathered speed. What had begun in shadows was moving toward its reckoning in the light, and the community that once admired the Millers now waited to watch them face judgment for the darkest betrayal a family could hold. By September 2022, the courthouse in Houma had become the stage for one of Louisiana's most sensational trials. Crowds wrapped around the block each morning, pressing against barricades, straining to glimpse Tom and Emily Miller as deputies escorted them through side entrances. Television vans lined the street. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, beaming every development beyond Terrebonne Parish. Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension. Neighbors, shrimpers, and families filled the benches. Some came to mourn, others to satisfy morbid curiosity, but all came to see the collapse of the parish's most prominent shrimp farming family. The murmurs only hushed when the bailiff called for order and Judge Margaret Duval, stern and silver-haired, entered to preside. The prosecution opened with unwavering focus. Assistant District Attorney Carl Henson faced the jury and declared, "This is not simply a murder case. It is a story of deception, a conspiracy born of greed and power." Together, Tom and Emily Miller conspired to remove the one man who stood in their way, David Miller. He unfolded the evidence step by step, the forensic findings, the rope fibers, the anchor stone, the cart tracks, the confessions. The picture was grimly clear. Emily sat with her head bowed, her lawyer whispering in her ear. Tom, in contrast, sat rigid, his jaw set, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The defense teams pursued opposite strategies. Emily's attorney painted her as a young woman ensnared by an older man's control. Tom's defense described Emily as the manipulative instigator, the one who had driven her father-in-law to an unspeakable act. On the second day, Emily took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted the months before David's death. She spoke of Tom's presence in the house, his pressure, his hold over her. "I was afraid," she told the jury. "I never wanted David harmed. I loved him. But Tom made me feel trapped. He made it seem like there was no way out." Her testimony drew murmurs, and several jurors leaned forward, their expressions taut with unease. When Tom testified, his tone was icy, commanding. He faced the jury like a foreman addressing workers. "David was weak," he declared. "He would have ruined everything I built." Emily knew it. She was the one who begged me to act. She called David out that night. She set it in motion. His voice sharpened, striking like a hammer. "Yes, I swung that post, but don't let her pretend innocence. She was there every step." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Duval struck her gavel for silence, her eyes narrowing at the spectacle. For the crowd, it was gripping theater. Husband and wife turned enemies, clawing at each other in the harsh light of justice. For Harris, seated quietly behind the prosecution, it was confirmation of what he had seen from the start. Lies that once bound them had rotted into public blame. Witnesses followed. Neighbors who recalled late-night arguments, deputies who described finding David's body, forensic experts who walked the jury through every shred of evidence. The story repeated from every angle. David had been lured, struck, bound, and drowned in secrecy. The plan was deliberate, not accidental. By the third week, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution urged the jury to see the pair as joint actors in a single crime. "They confessed in parts, they accuse each other in desperation," Henson said, "but the facts are not divided. Together they took David's life. Together they must answer." Tom's lawyer pleaded that his client was a father undone by manipulation, a man who snapped under Emily's spell. Emily's lawyer countered with the image of a young woman overpowered by a domineering patriarch. The jury sat stone-faced, absorbing each word. Outside, Houma buzzed with speculation. Some believed Emily deserved mercy, others demanded equal punishment. Old fishermen shook their heads, saying the bayou itself had revealed the crime. Reporters broadcast live debates from the courthouse steps. The parish had never seen such a trial, and the whole state seemed to wait with bated breath. In the back row, Harris sat quietly, his hands clasped. His eyes lingered on the empty witness stand. For him, the trial wasn't about the spectacle or the headlines. It was about David Miller, the young man in the photograph that still sat on his desk. A son betrayed, a life stolen. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the truth already weighed heavy in the room, and Harris knew the reckoning was near. The jury deliberated for just under 8 hours. Outside the courthouse, crowds lingered through the night, gathered under street lamps, murmuring in anxious tones. Reporters filed updates by the hour, speculating on whether Tom Miller would face death row and what punishment Emily might receive. For Houma, it felt as though the entire parish was holding its breath. When the jurors returned the next morning, the air inside the courtroom was heavy and expectant. Judge Margaret Duval took her seat, face composed, hands folded. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, and the verdicts were read. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of accessory to murder for Emily Miller, guilty. Tom did not move. He sat as he had throughout the trial, jaw clenched, pride shielding him from display. Emily, by contrast, crumbled. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing as the words reverberated. The sentencing phase began later that week. The prosecution pressed for the harshest penalties: death for Tom, decades in prison for Emily. Emily's lawyer pleaded that she had been manipulated, swallowed by fear, and deserved mercy. Tom's counsel, with far less ground, argued his client's act had been tragic, but not premeditated. Judge Duval listened, expression unreadable. When the time came, her gavel struck once, sharp and final. Thomas Miller, this court sentences you to death by lethal injection. Emily Miller, you are sentenced to 30 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 20. Gasps rippled through the room. Some murmured approval, others shook their heads in protest. Outside, the crowd split sharply, half demanding harsher punishment for Emily, half insisting she had already lost her life in everything but name. But there was no division over Tom. A man once hailed as the king of the bayou shrimp farms would die not remembered for his empire, but for destroying his own bloodline. That night, every television station replayed the verdict. Commentators debated endlessly. Was Emily a conspirator or a pawn? Was Tom always a monster or simply consumed by pride? But for most in Terrebonne Parish, the answers mattered less than the fact that justice had at last been delivered. Harris kept clear of cameras and debates. Instead, he drove to the Miller property. The farm stood silent, its ponds dark, the once bustling grounds now hollow. Pond number 5 remained scarred and cordoned, its still water reflecting the last of the daylight. The farmhouse loomed pale and lifeless, a shell of prosperity rotting in silence. Linda joined him at the fence line. "It's over," she whispered. Harris shook his head. "The law has spoken. But wounds like this don't close with a gavel. The family lost a son. The parish lost its trust. That doesn't end with a sentence." He looked out across the water, thinking of the photograph still on his desk. Justice gives order, but it doesn't give back what was taken. They stood together for a long while, the cicadas humming. Finally, Harris turned to leave. "The truth always finds its way up," he said quietly. "Sometimes through evidence, sometimes through confession, sometimes through the land itself, but it never stays buried." In Houma, life resumed. Shrimpers went back to their boats at dawn, children to their classrooms, church bells to their Sunday rhythms. Yet the story of the Millers lingered like a caution in every whispered conversation. A father's pride, a wife's entanglement, and a son's trust, each drowned in a pond that had refused to keep its secret. For Harris, the case became another weight on the long chain of memory he carried as a detective. Not a headline, not a courtroom drama, but the face of David Miller, 32 years old, gone too soon. He hoped that beyond the bayou and beyond the courthouse, some measure of peace had finally found the young man whose life had been stolen by the two people who should have loved him most. The trial had ended, but its echoes lingered across Terrebonne Parish long after the verdict. For weeks, the courthouse lawn remained crowded. Some people still hungry for details, others unable to let go of the spectacle. Local papers ran follow-up stories about the Miller farm, about David's short life, about Emily's fall from grace. The bayou seemed quieter, as if even the marsh carried the weight of what had been revealed. In the women's wing of the Louisiana Correctional Institute, Emily Miller settled into her new reality. The first days blurred together. Orange jumpsuits, metal bunks, the clang of steel doors. She spent hours staring at the cinder-block walls, replaying the trial in her mind. Some nights she wept into her pillow. Other nights she sat rigid, haunted by the image of David's face, sometimes tender, sometimes accusing. To other inmates, she was just another arrival, her notoriety fading quickly inside those walls. She was Emily no longer, only inmate 45782. Tom Miller's world was different. Transferred to death row at Angola prison, he carried himself with the same authority he once commanded on his farm. Guards described him as cold, aloof, dismissive. When he spoke, it was often to blame Emily. "She ruined me," he muttered to a chaplain. "She poisoned this family." Yet in the thin silence of night, no one knew what thoughts clawed at him. He had years, perhaps, before his sentence would be carried out, but the certainty of it hung like a storm cloud. David Miller's family tried to rebuild. His mother, long estranged from Tom, returned quietly to Houma. Each Sunday she lit candles at church for the son she had lost. Neighbors brought casseroles, offered prayers, spoke softly. Yet grief has a way of settling into the bones. For her there was no true comfort. For Detective Michael Harris, the case lived on, not in files, but in memory. He pinned David's photograph to the wall above his desk, alongside other victims whose stories had shaped his career. Each time he looked at those faces, he reminded himself why he kept walking into the dark corners of humanity. Justice was never perfect, but it was light enough to push back the shadows. Linda Parker, his younger partner, asked him one evening as they left the office, "Do you ever get used to it? Watching families destroy themselves?" Harris paused, his hand on the door. "No," he said quietly. "If you ever got used to it, you'd stop being human. You just learned to carry it." Autumn settled over Houma. The Miller farm lay abandoned, weeds rising where shrimp once thrived. Pond number 5 stood stagnant, its still surface reflecting emptiness, a scar no rain could wash away. Children whispered about it, daring each other to get close. To their parents, it was no ghost story but a wound, proof that pride and silence could rot even the strongest family from within. In prison, Emily began attending chapel services. She often sat in the back, silent, listening more than praying. Once she told a counselor, "I wish I had spoken sooner. I wish I had run." The counselor only nodded. Regret was a language spoken fluently in those halls. Tom refused every offer of counseling. He kept to himself, writing letters no one received, staring at the ceiling of his cell. The man who had lorded over acres of ponds now paced a space no bigger than a tool shed, his pride unbroken, even as it had become his cage. Life in Houma went on. Boats left the docks at dawn. Children returned to schoolyards. Church bells rang on Sundays. But the name Miller no longer carried respect. It carried a warning. One evening, Harris drove past the old farm. The sun was sinking, bleeding red across the marsh. He leaned against the fence, listening to frogs croak and cicadas whine, the smell of brine in the air. In his mind, he saw David not as a victim, but as a young man with a faint smile, unaware of the shadows closing in. Harris whispered into the dusk, "We found the truth, son. I hope that's enough." The breeze carried his words across the water. Pond number 5 rippled faintly, silent witness to everything buried and brought back. The bayou never keeps its secrets forever. And as Harris turned toward town, he knew the Miller story would linger not for their wealth, not for their farm, but as proof of what pride and silence can destroy when left unchecked. By the spring of 2023, the Miller case had faded from headlines, but not from memory. In Houma, people still spoke of it in hushed tones, especially when passing the abandoned farm. The land remained untouched. The farmhouse shuddered. Pond number 5 lying deceptively calm. like a mirror reflecting the past. For the community, it was no longer news but legend, a cautionary tale parents whispered to their children about how pride could consume a family. Inside the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Emily Miller's life fell into rhythms she never imagined. Mornings began with the clang of doors and the shuffle of inmates lining up for head count. Afternoons meant laundry or kitchen duty. Evenings brought chapel services, where Emily had moved steadily closer to the front pews. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with gray despite her youth. In counseling sessions, she admitted, "I don't know who I was back then. All I know is I can't be her anymore." Among inmates, she was quiet, polite, often lost in thought. Some pitied her, others resented her notoriety. But behind bars, fame evaporated quickly. Emily Miller became simply inmate, 45782, another woman counting years, marking time not by birthdays or holidays but by parole eligibility. 30 years stretched ahead, yet she clung to the faint hope that time might soften the edges of her sentence and her conscience. Tom Miller's existence on death row was starker. At 63, his once imposing frame had begun to stoop. He coughed often, moved slower, though he refused medical attention. Pride had been his crown, and he would not surrender it, even as it strangled him. Guards heard his voice less often now, though when he did speak, it was usually to curse Emily. "She betrayed me," he muttered to another inmate. But the bitterness rang hollow against the steel bars. Deep down, even Tom must have known he had undone himself. Occasionally, letters reached him from strangers who either condemned him or bizarrely praised his defiance. He answered none. His world had shrunk to the size of a cell, his future narrowed to the shadow of a gurney. For Detective Michael Harris, new cases filled his days. By March, he was investigating a rash of stolen boats along the bayou, paperwork and interviews stacking high on his desk. Linda Parker teased him, "You'll retire one day and not know how to fish without a case file." Harris only smiled faintly. He had no taste for idleness. Yet the Miller case lingered in quiet ways. On late nights, Harris would pause before the wall of photographs in his office. David Miller's face looked back at him young, with that faint, uncertain smile. Harris sometimes spoke to the photo as though to a son. "We did right by you," he whispered. The truth stood. Houma's people continued to wrestle with the farm's legacy. Some wanted the land bulldozed, others argued it should become a memorial. Children dared each other to run to the fence line, telling stories of ghosts. For the older generation, it wasn't ghosts, but grief. They saw the farm as a reminder that love without humility curdled into ruin. Emily's mother visited her once, traveling hours to the prison. The meeting was thick with silence, until Emily finally said, "I don't expect forgiveness." Her mother clasped her hands. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give. You'll have to find it in yourself." Emily wept quietly, the tears she had held back for months spilling at last. Meanwhile, word spread that Tom's health was failing. Some locals muttered that death before execution would be too easy. Others said it made no difference. Either way, the inevitability hung heavy, a bell tolling slowly in the distance. As spring turned to summer, Harris drove past the Miller farm once more. The weeds had climbed high, nearly swallowing the fences. Pond number 5 shimmered under the heat, its surface bright but hiding darkness beneath. Harris parked and stood at the roadside, hands in his pockets, listening to the wind across the marsh. He thought of David not in death, but as a man who might have rebuilt this farm differently, perhaps with less pride, more patience. The bayou smelled of salt and mud, eternal, indifferent to human tragedies. Harris let the silence stretch before he turned back to his car. Cases would keep coming, families would keep breaking, but he carried each one. That was the burden of his work, and the measure of his humanity. The Miller case was officially closed, yet it lived on in memory, etched into the land, into the water, into the people who had witnessed it. Pride had destroyed a father. Fear had silenced a wife. And some stories, Harris knew, cling to the land, whether people want them to or not. But the story doesn't end here. Behind every verdict lies more secrets, more twists, and darker truths yet to surface. Stay tuned for part 2, where the drama deepens and the revelations will leave you breathless.